There are two issues when it comes to Donald Trump and national security. One is simply policy. The policies he chooses to follow, implement, and one can argue with that as we do, whether they're right or wrong for the country, enhance our national security, or diminish it. But what is unusual, and what is perhaps more of a risk to the country, is his overall, I think you can call it just incompetence and ignorance.
That's the voice of David Corn, Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones and on-air analyst for MSNBC. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. But first, here are your co-hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back to Press the Button. Thanks for joining us for our 61st episode. We have, as usual, a packed show for you today. But first, we want to say thank you to all of you who joined us at our virtual Chain Reaction Gala Monday night.
We are recording this just a few hours before the event, so I really hope it went well.
Well, we have over 1,000 people registered for the event. Usually we do this at the San Francisco Jazz Center. We have about 250 people. So this is the first time we're doing it nationally, even internationally. We have some people overseas registering. We're planning it as a way of integrating the analysis of the multiple crises we're facing at this moment, the interconnection of these issues, the importance of Americans taking back their government and of reasserting core American values, including guaranteeing that every American has the right to a safe and secure future. Michelle, you look at some of these issues in the next segment of this show. What are you covering today?
That's right, Joe. Early Warning is covering the global protests against police brutality and racism and what efforts are happening within the national security community to respond, given these linkages and given how these issues are pervasive through every facet of our lives.
I got to say the demonstrations this week were just remarkable. They moved from the early violence you saw in the first few nights, the first reaction to the killing of George Floyd, into these massive peaceful demonstrations. And as the police and National Guard and paramilitary units withdrew, they got more and more peaceful, helping you understand what was part of the problem to begin with.
And I was also struck. One of my friends from France was talking this weekend about what it was like to go to the protests over in Paris and what it means for French society. These are truly global now. So we talk about this in Early Warning, and we also talk as well in both, I guess, a related and unrelated aspect, the Senate's response to the Trump administration's threats to conduct nuclear tests. Militarization affects, as I said, every aspect of our security.
Yes, there is a direct connection between the militarization of our national security strategy and the militarization of our police force. They took place over the same time period, involving some of the same weapons, the same people, the same attitudes. These things are linked. And we get at that in my interview with David Corn. David is the Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones and the author of Russian Roulette, the inside story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. He's the author of 3 other New York Times bestsellers, including Hubris, the inside story of spin, scandal, and the selling of the Iraq War that he wrote with David Ishakoff. It is my favorite book on the disastrous invasion of Iraq. I assigned it to my classes at Georgetown University for many years. You see David. You know who David is. He pops up all the time as an analyst and a contributor on MSNBC, but you may not know he's also my neighbor. He's about a block away. So I just took all the sound equipment up there and we sat down in his porch for an in-person, properly socially distancing interview. And we talked about how the 4 big crises we face now, the pandemic, the economic collapse, a corrupt and incompetent government, and the scourge of police violence interact with each other and impact on our national security. He has some compelling insights into what this tells us about the state of American power internationally and domestically, as well as some predictions for the 2020 election.
If you've been enjoying Press the Button, please let us know. You can leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And follow us on Twitter at PressButtonPod, at PressButtonPod, to receive updates about the show or send in any questions that you may have for me. We're not going to do a Q&A this week because I let the interview with David go a little longer. I think you will agree it was worth it.
We really hope you enjoy the show, but we've got to get started. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. Today on Early Warning, I'm joined by Akshai Vikram, Hale Fellow here at Plowshares Fund, and Neda, Shaheen, a fellow at Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation, and the co-chair of the Young Ambassador Program. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you.
So we have 7 minutes to cover the world's nuclear and national security news, and so our time starts now. Over the last 2 weeks, we've seen global protests against police brutality and racism sparked by the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor at the hands of police or vigilantes. This is not a new crisis. So why do you think we are seeing such a large, sustained response right now?
So I think, frankly, it's because this is a sustained problem. I mean, I'm coming to the show from Louisville, Kentucky, which is where Breonna Taylor was killed in March, where David McAtee was killed in a controversial clash with police a week or so ago. And this has been a problem that's gone on, as long as I can remember. I mean, I wasn't even born when Rodney King happened in Los Angeles. And we have not fixed this problem. And you see that Black Louisvillians and Black Americans are more likely to be killed, whether by the police or by civilians. They're also less healthy. Just going from East Louisville, the white part of town, to West Louisville, the Black part of town, you lose 15 years of life expectancy. And I think that at a certain point, people just have to say enough is enough. And I would say that there are two big takeaways from this. One is that for all of the money we've spent on national security since 9/11, back when I was in elementary school, the US government still cannot keep its people safe, especially Black people. So we need to reprioritize our budgets and ask ourselves what we're really focusing on as a country. And the second thing that's been pretty alarming is the militarization of police. I was driving around Louisville early last week, and I couldn't believe the amount of military-style hardware around. A lot of it, to be honest, looked like it was designed for the streets of Fallujah, not the streets of Louisville. And if you compare how quickly we were able to get military hardware to Louisville and other cities this week to how long it took to get personal protective equipment out to physicians and healthcare providers during the coronavirus pandemic peak back in April and March, it's really astonishing what we've chosen to emphasize as a country. And I think that needs to change.
I definitely echo everything Akshai said. I agree that this is a sustained problem and that it's something that is not new to any of us. Institutional racism and the structural discrimination that we see in the United States, specifically against the Black community and against communities of color, it impacts our national security front just in the fact that not all Americans are safe. And specifically just in the last year, in 2019, 24% of people killed by the hands of police were Black people, and yet Black people make up 13% of the U.S. population. When you bring the backdrop of COVID-19 into that, and you see amount of people who were so disproportionately impacted by that were also Black Americans, and you see how unsafe they are, not just in the police brutality aspect, but also in health risks and in other facets of the United States. It's a bigger problem, and it impacts every facet of our life here. And I guess also building on the militarization of police issue, this is something that I worked on before, just in police surveillance and in over policing of communities of color. And you've seen, the police surveillance aspect and the different militarization points in the police departments from, I think, definitely heightened since 9/11, but it's something that's been ongoing, especially against communities of color, for much longer than that. And it's never been dealt with or explicitly talked about before. And there needs to be a shift into putting those funds into public services, into communities, into different healthcare, education, housing, things that are actually important to having sustained community in the United States.
We've seen a lot of statements of solidarity since these protests really became larger. And so I'm wondering, Neda, especially for you in your role at WCAPS, what can individuals and organizations do to take action?
So at WCAPS, we had initially put out a statement from the organization, and then our Young Ambassadors group also put out a separate statement. And it was interesting because the WCAPS statement came out, and as that was coming out, the Young Ambassadors were like, we are the people inheriting this world, and we want to also put out a statement on what we demand this new world to look like when we take it over. From there, we had a lot of organizations put support to both of the statements. And we decided that we would do not just, solidarity, but also have action items. And so we came up with a sign-on letter with actual commitments that we are holding organizations accountable towards to actually change the face of international peace and security. We want, organizations to diversify their boards. We want to elevate the voices of Black people and people of color. We want to make sure that these agencies and industries are also hiring from different communities and that they're mentoring, not just starting who's in grad school, because some people, can't even make it to the grad school level, but starting to communities when they're younger so that these people who have been disenfranchised, so many communities that have been disenfranchised, can also reach these different high levels within the national security space. So we don't just want solidarity, we want actual change, and actual change can't just be had with, thoughts and prayers and we stand with you. There has to be actual action items that come forward. In addition to the statements, because we are a network of 900 women of color who work in peace and security, we've also been doing community discussions so that the women in our network can feel confident just sort of talking about how they feel and how this impacts them, and how so many women in our network can't express how they've been feeling these last few weeks because they will literally get fired from their jobs.
Where can listeners go to learn more?
So our website has everything, wcaps.org. We also put a lot of our information on our Facebook page. We have an Instagram, they're both WCAPsNet, at WCAPsNet, and you can follow there. Our Twitter is very lively, also at WCAPsNet. But we've been working on this issue really since 2017, when Ambassador Jenkins, came up with the initiative to redefine national security. And part of redefining national security is not just to include different areas of focus, but also to redefine the face of it and what it looks like and who's working in it and the different voices that are being heard in the industry.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to learning more about the discussion and participating. Akshai, our last question. We talked about nuclear testing last week. Any response from Congress?
Right. So Senator Markey of Massachusetts has put out a bill with the catchy name, the Preserving Leadership Against Nuclear Explosive Testing, or PLANET Act. And this act would ban the administration from using federal funds for nuclear testing with any sort of yield, so keeping the U.S. to a zero yield policy. It is encouraging that Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer of New York now supports the bill, but we'll see what luck it's going to have in a Republican-controlled Congress.
Well, with that, our time is up. Akshai, Neda, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Joe Cirincione, and I'm here with my friend and neighbor, David Corn. David's familiar to many of you from his multiple appearances on MSNBC and other news outlets. He's the Washington bureau chief of Mother Jones, a longtime commentator and chronicler of U.S. domestic and international issues, author of many books that you heard about when we introduced him at the beginning of the podcast. David, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Great to be with you, Joe.
We're here on David's front porch in Tacoma Park, so you'll hear some bird sounds, some barking dogs, some passing neighbors. This is my first socially distant live interview since the pandemic hit. And David, I very much wanted to talk to you because I want to get your view. I want the big picture from you. I want to know, how does the convergence of these multiple crises that we're experiencing, the pandemic, the economic crisis, a corrupt and incompetent president, and now mass demonstrations against police brutality, how do these compare to other critical moments in U.S. history that you've witnessed in your life?
Well, I think the technical term is that the shit's hitting the fan. You mentioned, not just one crisis, but several kind of interlocking crises. We have a pandemic that is disproportionately hitting communities of color, and then we have this police violence crisis, which also is centered on communities of color, all happening at once. The economy has collapsed, and as you and I are talking, there's some good economic news in terms of unemployment not skyrocketing and jobs being added to the economy. But even within that context, the unemployment rate for African Americans ticked up a small amount, but it went up while the overall rate went down. So we're seeing, in a lot of ways, a crisis in legitimacy in terms of the government, the social structure, of course, the police forces and the military forces, to the extent that they've been used in Washington, D.C., to create an environment opposed to civil, peaceful protest. And it's all centered, unfortunately, on one guy, Donald Trump. But what we're seeing is that the politics, the attitude towards government, what he has done to the federal government, is all coming home to roost at the same time. We have a pandemic that he denied and downplayed and dismissed and had an incompetent response to, and we've lost 108,000 Americans as of today. We have his inability to come to terms with the social protests raging across the nation, and in fact having stunts, photo ops, and using park police and other federal law enforcement officers to violently put down peaceful protests so he can hold up a Bible, which isn't his, and pretend that means something. So, there's all this chaos going on at the same time because we don't have leadership that can focus on the issues at hand, the connections between those, and not be driven by, it sounds hyperbolic, but a narcissistic need to be worshipped, praised, to have the whole world revolve around you. So we see this impact on the way Americans are relating to each other. We see this impacting our institutions like the military. It was stunning to have the leader of the military to come out and say, we do not get political.
Yes.
We are not going to be drawn into this, after the commander of the
chairman of the Joint Chiefs
Joint Staff and the defense secretary were used in a photo stunt to basically describe, depict the protesters as an occupying force that had to be put down with militarized means. Every institution of America is being stressed. Our education system, our public health system, certainly Congress, by the chaos and incompetence that Trump has brought to bear on the government itself, but just on society at large.
Let me roll in one other factor. You're coming out with a new updated edition of Russian Roulette that documented the Russian attack on the 2016 election and the Trump campaign's collusion with the Russians. Where do we stand now on Russia's manipulation of the elections? How worried are you about what might happen in the 2020 elections?
I'm worried tremendously about the 2020 elections overall. We have Trump in the last couple of weeks, I've written about, saying repeatedly that the Democrats are going to steal the election from him. He is saying outright, as a declarative statement, the Democrats are going to steal the election from me. So what he's saying is, if I lose, it'll be because the election is rigged. And of course, you're going to have the same old Republican tactics of trying to suppress the vote, particularly the African American vote, with all sorts of disinformation techniques, which we see this already with them targeting Joe Biden as being, as Trump is saying in his own fundraising pieces and campaign pieces, that Biden is a tool of China and is China's candidate, and that China is intervening. They're making these claims that China is intervening in the U.S. to help Biden win because Trump's so tough in China. On top of that, what we saw in 2016 was that the Russians did probe election systems throughout the country. They got into registration databases and the like. As far as we know, they didn't do anything. They didn't take any steps to change voting counts or to, get in the way of people voting. But imagine if somehow they, and again, it doesn't just have to be the Russians. We know they intervened in 2016, and we're told by FBI Director Christopher Wray and John Ratcliffe, the new Director of National Intelligence, that they are intervening again. So we know they're up to something again. We don't know what it is. But imagine if they got back into these systems.
So what's the impact of all this on national security? You recently wrote for Mother Jones, quote, "From viruses to nuclear weapons, this president is a national security threat." You were talking about his withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty. You go on to say, Trump's latest action follows a pattern of him ripping up treaties that aim to control the proliferation of nuclear arms and prevent nuclear war. In 2018, he blew up the Iran nuclear deal negotiated by President Obama and a handful of other countries. Last year, he shredded the INF treaty. All of this is worrisome, but what makes it more alarming is that Trump has a history of uttering remarks about nuclear weapons that display his profound ignorance about this all-important subject.
There are two issues when it comes to Donald Trump and national security. One is simply policy. The policies he chooses to follow, implement, and one can argue with that, as we do, whether they're right or wrong for the country, enhance our national security, or diminish it. And so ripping up the Iran deal, ripping up nuclear arms treaties, all that is troublesome, but it's a type of arguments and policy disputes that we would have with with most Republicans in the White House and conservative national security advisors like John Bolton, and we're used to that we saw that in the Reagan years, we saw that in the Bush years, we argued about the Iraq War, and he's wrong, but it's not unusual in that regard. But what is unusual, and what is perhaps more of a risk to the country, is his overall, I think you can call it just incompetence and ignorance when it comes to a lot of issues. National security means protecting the country from threats. And so the biggest threat we faced in the last few years, decades, I don't know how long it goes, is this one particular pandemic. That is a national security threat. And it involves dealing with other countries, where the virus comes from. It involves dealing with international organizations, trying to come up with the best responses. And in this issue, Trump just didn't care. He believed that somehow closing your eyes and engaging in magical thinking is a way to confront it. So right there, we saw a person in a position of leadership who didn't understand how to do his job. We've seen in the civil unrest of the last few days that he looks at the military not as an institution to implement policy, but as his almost own private Praetorian Guard. That's dangerous as well. It really is sort of putting a lot of pressure on the bond between the military and the citizenry. So that is a national security issue. If he does anything to delegitimize the military, to create more conflict between the military and civilians and the citizens, that too undermines national security. But this is a guy overall who just believes that you don't need to know anything. He has no consistency, he doesn't talk to experts, he doesn't care, he has no attention span, so he'll bomb Syria one day and then not think about it for a couple of years.
Do you worry about a wag the dog scenario?
Trump likes to be in control of a political narrative, even if it's a chaotic one, even if it's the chaos he causes. He wants to have enemies. He wants to shape a narrative. That's one reason why the pandemic narrative was so difficult for him, because he couldn't control it, he couldn't shape it, and he couldn't really point to an enemy, an invisible enemy. That doesn't really work so well. And then he's tried to turn China into an enemy, but kind of really long after the fact. in terms of his own bobbling and botching of the response. And so now what does he turn to? Thugs and Antifa. He needs to have an enemy. Given all that, given those, I think, political and I think deeply psychologically rooted desires and needs of his, a wag the dog scenario is entirely possible. So it's conceivable that, if he runs out of people domestically, that he might do so globally. He doesn't have the ability to pay attention to a subject long enough to truly prosecute a war. Yes. He can't like spend 6 months. He saw that, the getting stuck in Iraq was bad for George W. Bush. He loves to talk about blowing things up and defeating ISIS and all these other things, but he doesn't have the psychological or intellectual wherewithal to really run a war.
We're an equal opportunity podcast. We criticize Democrats and Republicans. We criticize policies, not parties. How confident are you that if the Democrats are fortunate enough to win the White House, that they can correct some of these problems, they can resolve some of these crises?
One of my concerns is that should, let's just say, Joe Biden become president, when the election goes smoothly enough that he wins and somehow takes office on January 20th, 2021, I still think if that happens, there will be a tremendous amount of political chaos and turmoil. Trump won't go, if he goes, he still won't go quietly. And I don't know what the makeup of Congress will be, but if it's still controlled by Republicans, you'll see somewhat of a political civil war. Trump may announce that he's running again in 2024 immediately, and just try to create a almost a separate country within a country. We know that Joe Biden, on an issue that you care about, arms control, has been working on it literally for decades. Mm-hmm. Literally, he was like the go-to guy in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and that he's committed to this. He understands the importance. He clearly is not running as a hawk. Hillary Clinton in 2008 and 2016, when she ran for president, was much more hawkish than Joe Biden or any of the other Democratic contenders running. I mean, he is, an establishment politician with establishment policies, but I don't think he's looking for a war. I think his focus is on, as he would put it, healing the country. I'm not sure it's healable, but dealing with the economic crises that will still likely be at hand. And he does seem to care about climate change. He does seem to care about a cancer initiative. What he does about China, Russia, big foreign policy issues, I don't know.
Right, so those are policy issues. Those you can say, okay, what should our policy be on North Korea? Here's what Trump did. Here's what I proposed as a Democrat. But there are also systemic issues. And I'm particularly worried about the corruption of our entire political process, the corruption in our military procurement system. Why are we spending $750 billion on national defense now as compared to $300 billion before 9/11? Let me give you an example. A friend of mine and one of my board members is now supporting a woman named Kendra Haynes, an African-American woman challenging the incumbent Jim Cooper in Nashville, Tennessee. He sent me a list of Jim Cooper's top 5 campaign contributors. 3 of them are defense contractors. Jim Cooper is the chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee in the House Armed Services Committee. He's deciding on the nuclear programs, and he's taking money from Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin, among others. Isn't this just a blatant conflict of interest? And also, isn't it just business as usual in Washington? Do you think the Democrats can do anything about this?
Yeah, well, Trump was right about one thing. There is a swamp in Washington of interest that sees hold of the agencies and often of Congress. I mean, that it is a bipartisan matter. It's been going on under Democratic and Republican administrations, where the House and Senate are controlled by Democrats or Republicans. And, we still, all the problems we had before Trump came into office are still there.
Yeah.
He's just given us a whole new set of problems, some of which are more existential.
Right, so this is what I'm asking you. Will all the focus be just on reversing Trump? And I see a lot of Democrats, the way they're campaigning, it's all about criticizing Trump. But what they're proposing isn't exactly clear. And aside from Elizabeth Warren, I don't hear many people talking about the corruption in the system.
Right. Well, I think in some ways, we lived in a house with a lot of problems, and before Trump came along, and now he set it on fire. Right, so we have to put out the fire before we go back in and say, oh, there's rot in the foundation, there's mold in the walls, there are roaches, in the kitchen, all these things that we saw in our democracy beforehand, and which I've written about, you've talked about, and written about, for years. A lot of it's gotten worse. Now, the interesting thing, you mentioned Elizabeth Warren. She's talked a lot about corruption in the military procurement system, and what happens, if she becomes vice president, if she's picked and they win, will this still, then you will have somebody sharing the bully pulpit who cares about this.
And with an analysis and with the program.
Yes, with a plan. She literally does have a plan.
I am desperately trying to interview Elizabeth Warren before I finish up my tenure as the host of this podcast. If you're listening, Elizabeth Warren staff, please call me.
But so there's one instance where maybe you'll get lucky in terms of having somebody assume a position of power who understands this issue, cares about it, and actually wants to do something about it. But in terms of how big money influences politics, not just in the defense side, but whether you're talking about hedge funds and Wall Street and healthcare industry, big pharma, every place else, we've lost ground through the Trump years. And that's an issue, something that Bernie Sanders ran on, right?
Yes.
Again and again.
Yes.
In 2016 and 2020.
Another man with an analysis and a plan.
Right. And, we would have to, people who care about these issues, once you catch your breath, if there's a new president, we'll have to get back in and keep fighting for them. Now, the interesting thing about the economic crisis and the police violence crisis is that it has led to some wider discussions about systemic issues in the United States, whether it's systemic racism, systemic problems with the healthcare system, and has shown, to a lot of us, or confirmed for a lot of people, that we're not as great as we think we are. We're not being made great again, because we weren't necessarily that great before. While there are a lot of great aspects to our country, and a lot of Americans have done great things for themselves and for the nation, there are a lot of deeply rooted problems and flaws that need to be addressed in a comprehensive manner. So that whole notion that, okay, we need to take a good look at ourselves. Now, one problem with this is, when we look at ourselves and take that good look, there's a lot to see. There's a lot to see, a lot to deal with. So when we start looking and saying, hey, how do we make America a better society? There's a lot there. In that list, also climate change, which, should require, does require a profound change in how we consume energy. And how we engage with the whole world globally in the energy ecosystem. And corruption in our democracy, which includes, the pay-to-play campaign donations and institutional bribery, as well as gerrymandering and voter suppression, is a strong piece of this. So, come next year, if there is a chance, everyone's going to have to really take a moment or two, relax, and then say, okay, there's, a tremendous amount of work to be done.
Yeah. So let me ask you about the way we
do that work. And this is we're going to close with this: the organizing strategy for this particular moment, for these crises. How do you do this? At Plowshares Fund, we have a strategy that we've been implementing for the last 2 years, building up to the chance of possibly making transformational change in our nuclear policy. We've been funding groups, working on plans, working on policies, and we're going to be ready to hit the ground running if the window opens up for this change next year. But how exactly you do this is up for grabs right now. You recently tweeted about something that Jennifer Rubin, the conservative Washington Post columnist, said in an article where she was calling for a popular front against Donald Trump. Now, a popular front is a particular term of art. This really comes out of the struggles of the 1930s. And it's a broader sort of coalition effort, broader than a united front.
Yeah.
And what she's saying is that this might be a moment where liberals, progressives, and conservatives can all unite. What do you think about that? Is there a possibility for this kind of broad, united action?
My tweet in response to her, if I can recall now, was something like, we're not really in a left-right moment, not even maybe in an R D versus D moment. We're in a moment where we're talking about reality versus propaganda, decency versus demagoguery, and that's sort of the division here. We have, Trump has sort of radicalized the nation in a way in which he, campaigns quite proudly as a divisive fellow who lies incessantly and doesn't acknowledge reality, has been a racist, has been demagogic, and guess what? Tens of millions of Americans say, yeah, right on, man. I like that. I want that. And then what we're seeing, particularly in recent days, and what we've seen throughout to a lesser degree throughout the Trump years, with some Republicans, only a few, calling themselves never Trumpers, are people who get together and say, no, what matters first is that we have leadership that is honest, that is democratic, that pledges allegiance to the values of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, that values honest and free discourse, and that we have a country where we can honestly debate nuclear policy. Should we have more missiles or less missiles? More warheads or less warheads? Some people believe more is better. You know that. We think they're wrong, but they honestly believe that, and we debate with them. But it's a debate over what to do, not what reality is. And so what Jennifer was talking about, and what I tweeted in reference to, is this may be a moment where it's not about lefties versus righties, liberal versus conservative. It may be about what you see, what you yearn for in a society. What is the American society? What is fundamentally the American society? Fundamentally, the American society is neither left nor right, right? Yeah. It's not a set of policies, it's a set of values. And are there enough people who are offended and see what Trump is doing to that idea of the ideal American society, that they join together and realize that is the top priority?
So at Mother Jones, you cover all these issues, domestic, international, etc., as a magazine. And it's been doing it for decades. When did Mother Jones start?
74.
74. So I've been talking to a lot of people, my own staff, my own board, about where we go with the nuclear movement. How do we get an end to this nuclear overkill? How do we cut the nuclear budgets? How do we cut the military budget? And it's clear to me that we're not going to have another mass anti-nuclear movement like there was in the 80s. But we don't have to, because there's already a vibrant mass movement in this country, and we've seen it in these last 10 days or 2 weeks, taking to the streets almost spontaneously. You see more Americans involved in the political life of this country than I think I've ever seen in my lifetime. So what we need to do is take this nuclear issue and bring it into these other movements. And what we need to do is take their issues and bring it into our movement. So Plowshares has issued a statement, for example, on the police brutality
in Minneapolis and on the racial divide in our country. And you've seen scores of organizations issue statements in this regard. Do you think there's a possibility from where you sit, from how you're looking, do you think it's possible that we might be able to unite these movements for economic justice, for racial justice, for climate justice, for those of us who seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons? Can we bring these various movements together? Do you see any efforts to do that?
I think the answer is yes on the broader front. If you talk about economic justice, you're talking about how we collectively use our dollars in terms of what we're taxed on, and what our priorities are in the use of those dollars that are collected from Americans. And I think there is certainly the space. We look at, okay, how we used our money, what is the state of our public health system, what is our state of education system, what is the state of inner cities, what is the state of rural America, and see, well, are we using our resources wisely? And the answer, you and I agree on is no. That we're overemphasizing the military budget, and we are underemphasizing health, education, welfare, infrastructure,
climate,
and climate, of course. Infrastructure is kind of, can be tied in with climate. Climate can be tied in with basically everything. And that it seems to me there, when you talk about national priorities, which I think is a good word to use, you can talk about, okay, what are the priorities of the people in the street this week? They want, the focus is just on what's happening with police brutality. That's one thing, but I do believe we're talking about bigger things. We're talking about the disparity in how the coronavirus is impacting low-income neighborhoods, which tend to be more neighborhoods with people of color. So you talk priorities, and on the list of priorities, is there room to shift the priorities from where they are at the moment, from the status quo? And perhaps the answer is yes, and that we can sort of say we need to put more money into communities that feel they don't have a lot of buy-in to American society and have a lot of anger that is justified. And where does that money come from? Well, one place obviously is the Pentagon. Now, so much of the government and policy resembles an oil tanker. When they make a turn, it takes them tens and tens of miles to make a right-hand turn. And the same thing with an aircraft carrier. And so we need to sort of start thinking about, we talk about bending the arc of justice, or bending the curve of the pandemic. We need to bend the curve of our priorities, and bend the curve so that we are spending less on the Pentagon. And then you have a debate or discussion or what can go. And part of that obviously are how necessary are nuclear weapons. Now there's a moral reason, there's a strategic reason why we should try to abolish nuclear weapons with other nations as well, and there's a security reason, of course, in trying to prevent proliferation to other countries and the transmission of small bombs or weapon-grade material that can be used by smaller actors rather than states with big missiles. So there are all those, good reasons for that. But I think if you're talking thematically, I think it's, given, where people seem to be now, given the years of Trump, I think it's hard to make abolition of nuclear weapons in and of itself one of the top 3 points. I think changing the priorities of the country is certainly one of the top 3 points. And, that framework. Now, the good news is, potential good news is, that if Biden does become president, he actually has an interest in the particular reasons for limiting and reducing nuclear stockpiles. He understands, though, notions and the rationales of arms control, and as do most of the Democrats that pay attention to foreign policy in Congress. And so there'll be a lot of latitude there to renew treaties, strengthen treaties, maybe seek better treaties. I still don't know what you do with North Korea. That's like a puzzle no one really knows what to do with. But nevertheless, and he will, unlike Trump, hire people who care about things.
Yes.
So the people who are in charge of, arms proliferation and nuclear treaties at the State Department, at the Pentagon, there will be people within the government with this priority who will do the work regardless of what's happening on the streets and in the political culture. That's why elections matter, right? Get different Supreme Court, get different people in the bureaucracy with the right priorities. They do that. I think their case, their work, any work that a member of Congress wants to do becomes easier if it happens within a context of a larger theme, which is changing our priorities. We're changing our priorities. We don't need the military we have. It's oversized. It may not even be structurally appropriate for the battles and the challenges and the threats of the 21st century here. If you make that larger argument, it makes it easier for the people who are doing the worker bees to do their work. If you create a better environment for the honeycomb, and you put it in the right place, and you keep the predators away, whatever it is. I know this is a stupid metaphor, but then the people who pay attention to the details of the policy can make the incremental advances that really are the only way things work these days.
This is great. David, I've kept you longer than I promised, but I just didn't want to stop listening to you. I just want to thank you very much for taking the time. I hope that we can make the kind of changes that you and I want, and that next summer we can gather on your porch and we can talk about the really important things, like how the Washington Nationals and the Boston Red Sox doing.
Oh, yes. And thanks to the Plowshares Fund for the work that it's done, and Joe, thank you for being such a great voice of reason on TV, in print, in tweets for many years. I know you're approaching retirement. It's hard to envision that as someone who's watched you be so active for years, but you deserve a lot of credit for what you've done and for laying the foundation for good work that we have the potential to start on perhaps next year.
Thank you, David.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.